75 years ago, 50 countries signed a charter that changed the course of history. The United Nations Charter marked the start of a new world order. Its founding principle was international collaboration. Today, nationalist agendas and great power rivalry threaten the future of the global organisation. We asked Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary-General, whether the organisation is fit for purpose in the 21st century.
So, Mr. Guterres, the UN turns 75 at a moment of multiple crises and new challenges. You said yourself that these are dark days.
How would you define the biggest challenges?
I think we have two kinds of challenges. One is the fact we are an intergovernmental organization, and as an intergovernmental organization that has bodies like the General Assembly or the Security Council, it depends on the capacity of member states to come together, especially when we have such dramatic challenges as the COVID-19 or climate change or the impact of new technologies in our economies and our societies. And the truth is that we have now a very dysfunctional relationship, namely among the three biggest powers. And that dysfunctional relationship makes it very difficult for the Security Council to take adequate decisions in relation to the major crises we face, and it creates other difficulties in the way the organization works. The other challenges that are more related to our own activities, the secretariat of the organization, is, of course, the need to be able to make the organization more nimble, more effective, more cost-effective, and we have devoted ourselves very strongly to the reform, the internal reform of the organization. I think we made a lot of progress on that, but of course there is still a long way to go.
If you take your first point that the relationship between three major powers is dysfunctional. Well, this is hardly new for the United Nations. What makes this different from, if you take the broad sweep of 75 years of the United Nations, how has this changed?
The present pattern is relatively new. We had, of course, the Cold War, and the Cold War had its rules. There were two superpowers, essentially. Those two superpowers were confronting each other in many aspects, but to a certain extent, everything was predictable. Then we had a period of, I would say, American supremacy. In the 90s, I was Prime Minister of Portugal. And again, the rules were clear. Now it's much more messy. We have three more relevant powers, the United States, China, and Russia. But the relationship is very dysfunctional. It's very unpredictable. It's much more difficult to create an international environment in which the spoilers are forced to play by the rules.
How much more difficult is it made by the fact that America has stepped back to some extent from the world? We already saw this under President Obama, nation building at home, but now we see this even more with Donald Trump, who is, for example, pulling America out of the World Health Organization. Can the UN function without an engaged America?
I don't think the international community can live without a strong engagement of the United States in international affairs. If we want to promote a number of key values, democracy, human rights and others, where I believe the presence of the United States, of a functional United States, would be extremely, extremely important.
But you're very careful in how you treat President Donald Trump, for example. You may be critical of American policy, you never criticize him by name. Is that a deliberate strategy?
I do not believe that in international politics it's good to enter into personal confrontations with whoever. That leads nowhere, and I think I have a major responsibility to preserve the United Nations and to preserve a functional relationship with all the key partners of the United Nations, including, obviously, the United States.
And what about the other major powers? First of all, China. You've been criticised for not speaking up loudly enough on human rights, for example, with China. How do you handle this question of China having a very different view of human rights?
The most spoken question when we talk about human rights in relation to China is, of course, the Uyghur question. I had the occasion to discuss it several times with the Chinese authorities to make it public and to clearly assert that human rights need to be fully respected there. And more than that, in situations where you have a minority, it is absolutely essential that all communities feel that their identity is respected, and at the same time that they are recognized as part of the community as a whole.
And let's not forget Russia. It's asserting itself more and more and vetoing many UN Security Council resolutions. How do you handle the somewhat disruptive behaviour of Russia, and how do you get towards a Security Council that can actually agree on things?
Our strategy is simple, is to tell the truth and to make the proposals that make sense independently of sometimes being in opposition in relation to the positions of the Russian Federation. Just to give you an example, we have been very clear in recent times asking for cross-border humanitarian aid to be possible in relation to Syria. And so this has been a bone of contention in relation to the Russian Federation in several moments. At the same time, it's true to recognize that the Russian Federation has put a lot of pressure on the Syrian government to allow for the Constitutional Committee to move forward.
Russia has brazenly grabbed a piece of Ukraine. China has occupied disputed territories in the South China Sea. These are exactly the kind of areas where we would expect the Security Council to be active. Has it become too slow, and is it not being challenged enough to do the job it's there to do?
Well, the Security Council is not an abstract entity. It is an entity with member states, and 5 of those member states have a veto right. And we know that whenever there is a very serious question related to the Israeli-Palestinian question, the Americans will veto. We know that there is a serious question in relation to the Ukraine or to Syria, the Russians will veto. And we know that there is something on the South China Sea or equivalent, China will probably veto. So we know that this is the reality. But I also think that people tend to look into the UN very much looking into the Security Council. But the UN is much more than that. I mean, the UN has a huge activity in the world that is sometimes ignored. We recently launched a global response package, humanitarian response package for the COVID-19 to support 110 million people in 64 countries. And these on top of all the other humanitarian action we are providing.
But I suppose my challenge to you might be that it is...
87 million people receives food assistance from the UN. So these are things that people sometimes forget.
And I suppose I wondered whether, in your view, the UN was pivoting towards judging itself by its successes in terms of humanitarian relief, refugee crisis, and the other things that it does in that sphere, World Health Organization, etc., and less about security.
We are, at the present moment, deeply engaged in Yemen, trying to bring together the parties to the conflict to reach an agreement, and we have been more far away. We have been very actively engaged, and I myself have been on the phone with the key actors of the conflict and with the regional powers and the global powers for that. Our objective is to have a global ceasefire in Yemen. We are doing the same, very actively engaged in supporting the peace process in Afghanistan. We are extremely engaged in Libya, and I must tell you, it's the biggest frustration of them all, because where the spoilers are constantly undermining the chance of a ceasefire in that context. But at the same time in Syria, I think it's fair to recognize that we have been able to bring together the parties, even in it's very difficult to make progress, but the Constitutional Committee was created, and that was an achievement of the UN diplomacy. Now, the truth is, if we had a united Security Council, if we had a functional relationship among the superpowers, then, of course, things would be much more easy. Then, of course, our action could be much more successful.
Could I talk about the relationship between China and Russia, which seems in some ways to have restored kind of character that harks back to the Cold War in many respects? And I'm wondering what you think the implications of that are. You're diplomatically saying it's obviously good if you get more cooperation between the major players. But in some ways, it's not so good if two of the major world powers who have anti-democratic views or leanings are buddying up together.
But I think it is clear that at the present moment, we have seen in the Security Council a bigger alignment between Russia and China, namely in relation to the Western countries. But that doesn't mean that that will be a permanent situation in relation to the future. I think it is defined by the present circumstances to a large extent. But when we look at the challenges of the world today, there is an absolute need for countries like Russia, China, and the United States to be able to understand that they need to work together to mobilize the whole of the international community for those challenges to be faced positively, be it climate change, COVID-19, or other similar aspects.
Can I turn you to the future of the UN? Here we are at 75. The institutions are really quite long in the tooth. They should rightly have some reform to modernise them. But is reform impossible given these divisions at the top?
One of my main objectives in everything I've been doing is exactly to reduce the bureaucracy in the UN and to make the UN much more nimble and much more effective. And I think we made some meaningful progress on that. That, of course, is a huge transformation also in the system of power in the organization. But having said so, I also think the UN needs to be humble and needs to listen. And that is the reason why, instead of using the 75th anniversary to launch, I would say, a big campaign to promote the UN, we put us exactly in a listening mode, and we launched a huge survey and a huge debate at the global level. The survey that was done in cooperation with several entities had already 222,000 answers of people coming from 193 countries, telling what they think about the future, what should be the priorities of international cooperation.
Are you hearing things in this great exercise that to some extent surprise you and make you think that the UN needs to change course in some ways?
What this survey is demonstrating, what the debates are demonstrating, there is a huge request of accountability of the UN, accountability of governments, accountability of institutions. And the transparency and accountability are probably the two most important demands that I feel, and that I will do my best to put in the center of our reform concerns in the UN.
Again, back to the grand sweep of history. What do you see the next period of the UN heralding? We've got to 75 years. Take us forward to 100 years.
There are two dimensions that I believe are absolutely crucial for the intervention of the UN in the future. One is climate change, and the other is the digital world. We have today a situation in which it is clear we live in a lawlessness in the cyberspace. We see artificial intelligence developing at a fantastic path, and we do not see effective mechanisms of governance. It's clear those mechanisms of governance cannot be the governance mechanisms of the past. The UN is better placed than any other organization today in the world to be that platform where different entities, government, civil society, businesses, science come together and try to find the mechanisms of the governance of the problems of the future.
Antonio Guterres, thank you very much for joining us.
It was a pleasure.
This interview is from our show, The Economist Asks, and every week we publish a new episode in which we interview key figures in world events. The link opposite will take you to a page with all of our previous episodes. Thanks for watching.